Thank you very much for being here. We're talking about cannabis again tonight. We had a program last evening with Ben Court. If you were joining us, you can take a little nap during this first few slides because I'm going to be sharing some things that are coming up that I might want to make sure you know about. First and foremost, I want to thank the Montgomery County Office of Drug and Alcohol who is supporting this program tonight. This is part of our 5-year grant. We're in the final year of this 5-year grant, the Youth Marijuana Prevention Project. I'm sad to tell you that we have not solved all the challenges surrounding cannabis use, especially with regard to young people, but we're working on it. And even though the grant is ending, we're still going to be talking about this in many years to come. I promise you that. So tonight we are recording this program, but we're very, very glad that you're here with us live. If you ask any questions after you hear from Dr. Levy, if there's anything personal that's asked, we will be editing that out. The finished product, the recording that will be on our YouTube channel will not have your name, your image, your personal information, any questions, none of that. So, but the great thing about being here live and not watching the recording is you can ask Dr. Levy some questions. And my colleague Judy Hirsch is here with me, and between the three of us, we hope to support you as best as we can. Judy's going to be putting some links in the chat in just a little bit. One thing I want to make sure you know about is that following up on tonight's program, you can visit this page, conversation.zone/cannabis. So we'll have some other information there that will help give you more details. If anything that Dr. Levy references is something we can share in a link, we'll have that there. I'll tell you about one thing in particular I'll point you to in just a little bit. But also want to bring up some things that we have coming up. On May 14th, we're going to be joining the folks in Montgomery County Drug and Alcohol and others for this Prevention Day press conference and block party. We're going to be at the Upper Merion Township Building in King of Prussia. We, at Be a Part of the Conversation, will have our mock teen bedroom set up. So it's a very educational opportunity to learn about what some of the devices are that are out there now. Vaping is a thing, so obviously, which can be cannabis and nicotine and other products. But lots of really great resources that day from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. at the Upper Merion Township Building. Please join us for that program. There's some more about vaping. So we're going to talk on Tuesday, May 21st. This is in person. So this will be just for our local folks in this Montgomery County region of Pennsylvania. The Springford Area High School is hosting us to talk about vaping, which can be, as I said, a lot of different substances, but primarily we're talking about nicotine and cannabis. We have an in-person program. No, this is on Zoom too. My apologies. Here we have the topic again, bridging the cannabis communication gap. This is on Wednesday, May 22nd on Zoom. This is a lunch and learn. We're going to try a middle of the day program and see if that's a good fit for folks. We'll be joined by Mallory Henry from Care and Treatment Center. And on another program on Zoom, this is for clinicians, for social workers, psychologists, also prevention providers. It's a continuing education program, no charge to attend on Zoom from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. on May 31st with Jess Malavi. We'll be talking about vicarious trauma and the way that could impact some of the providers that work in this field. You can find these and other programs on our website, as I said, conversation.zone/calendar. We have more than 140 programs recorded on our YouTube channel. I invite you to check that out. I just posted the program that was with Ben Court last night. If you weren't able to join us or if you want to share it with others, it is available on our YouTube channel. We have parent support group meetings that take place 5 days a week, 21 meetings every week. Some of them are on Zoom. Those are the meetings that are in green. The meetings in purple are in person. So you can click on these buttons on this page of our website to learn more about those meetings. There's no need to register, no need to check in with anybody. You can just show up and everyone there will be happy to have you join them. We also have a family recovery course that is a 3-part course. This is not a prevention program. This is for family members like Judy and me. We each have someone in recovery. When we were many years ago dealing with our son's substance use, we each have a son in recovery, but when we were in that very scary place, we were fortunate to be able to get some information and access some education about this, but so many families don't have that opportunity. And so this is a totally free 3-part course that is peer-led. You get an annual, you learn about how this has impacted your loved one, but especially how it's impacted you as a family member, and how family members can find our own kind of recovery and heal and have healthy boundaries going forward and that sort of thing. So check that out. We'd love to have you join us for that. That is capped at 12 individuals. So it's a nice small group setting, and it's almost all on Zoom. Oops, sorry. I did want to mention that we have a fundraising event come up. This is our one time a year that we ask you to support, be a part of the conversations. Programs like tonight's we never charge for these. And so this is an opportunity for us to raise some much needed funds to make sure that we can continue to bring you all the programs and services that I just described. So on to our very, very special guest. We're so thrilled that Dr. Levy is with us. She is the chief of the Division of Addiction Medicine at Boston Children's Hospital, whose mission it is to improve health and well-being and support positive development by reducing and preventing substance use and related conditions. The division's outpatient adolescent substance use and addiction program, otherwise known as ASAP, provides more than 6,000 visits to more than 500 patients and their families annually. Over the past 20 years, Dr. Levy has evaluated and treated thousands of adolescents with substance use disorders, and she's written extensively on the topic. In 2016, she established the nation's first accredited pediatric addiction medicine fellowship training program. Dr. Levy has also led large community-based trials with adolescents. Dr. Levy created an 8-lesson Audible original book called How to Talk to Your Kids About Drugs and Alcohol. And as Judy was just telling Dr. Levy before you joined us, this is how we found her. We listened to this Audible book, which I believe is free to download, even if you don't have an Audible account. And it is fantastic. Cannot recommend it enough. And there's a link to that on our follow-up page on that web page. I'll put a link to it in the chat at some point as well. Turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and for your nice introduction and words about the audio book. I hope that I'll leave you wanting more tonight. I have about 40 minutes prepared for tonight. I hope I'll leave you wanting more, and if that's the case, you can download it and listen to the entire course. But for tonight, just thank you for introducing me. I'm a pediatrician by training. I'm also an addiction medicine specialist, and I serve as the chief of the Division of Addiction Medicine at Boston Children's Hospital. This is the first division of addiction medicine at a pediatric hospital in the country. So it was really exciting last year when the hospital decided that the topic and the specialty area was important enough that it should be recognized as its own independent division. So tonight the topic is is cannabis. But before I start talking about cannabis or marijuana, I want to do a little bit of developmental neurobiology. I think it's really important that people understand what the special issues are for young people and substances and how they relate not just to behaviors and attitudes, but actually all of those things are based on brain development. So I'm starting with a very old slide that's showing you brain weight by age, okay? You can see weight is on the y-axis, age is on the x-axis. I've highlighted age 10 to 12. I didn't really change the axes because the font makes you appreciate how old this slide is. But you can see that at about age 10 to 12, the brain reaches its adult weight. Now, for most of human history, and I mean until about 150 years ago, people were considered adult when they reached the age of 13 or 14, right? And so there are examples of that, right? The Jewish bar mitzvah ceremony happens at age 13. That's actually a coming of age ceremony. If you've read Romeo and Juliet, the protagonists there are 14 years old in that story, although it's a very, very adult story, right? Now, I live with a 16-year-old, and so I find it really confusing and intriguing that until recently, people didn't notice that adolescents were different from adults. So as a little experiment, I went to Google and I typed in the word adolescent, and then I hit the image button, and I made a collage out of the first, a couple of the pictures that came up on the first page. And you're looking at that collage now, and it seems to me that even at a casual glance, it seems pretty obvious to me that, adolescence is a distinct developmental phase. It's really quite different from adulthood. And it's rather shocking that until recently, people didn't recognize that, right? But now, not only do we recognize it, and I think it actually the understanding kind of came backwards. Now we understand that there are developmental reasons. There are issues around brain development that underlie the behaviors that we see in adolescents, right? And with that knowledge, we've kind of gone back and been able to recognize this stage. So I'm showing you brain slices in this slide from individuals at different ages. So when you look on the left, you're seeing a slide of a brain from an individual at birth. And there you see few cells and few connections between them. And basically you're looking at a lot of room for growth, right? And that's probably what you would expect. As you go from birth to 6 years old, you see tremendous growth, right? You see more cells, you see more connections between the cells. We've really gone from sparse looking tissue to a dense tangle of neurologic tissue, right? Again, probably what you would expect, right? That you're going to get a lot of brain growth in the first few years of life. But then what happens from age 6 to age 14 seems to me a little surprising, because you're going from more tissue at 6 years old to less brain tissue at 14 years old. Now, the first time I saw these pictures, I thought, oh my goodness, do people peak intellectually at age 6? That doesn't seem like a very good thing for humanity. But fortunately, that's just the wrong interpretation. Really, what you're looking at is brains configured for different things. So the 6-year-old brain is configured for learning. All of that dense tissue makes it very easy for 6-year-olds to capture new information and new skills. They've got a lot to work with, right? It's got like this thick web where they can just capture whatever's presented to them in the environment and learn it. But there's a difference between a newly learned skill and a proficient skill. And so 6-year-olds are great at learning new skills, but older people are much more proficient. So what happens between 6 and 14 is that the brain actually eliminates the connections that it's not using or not using frequently. The ones that remain actually grow larger. It's kind of hard to tell in these pictures, right? Because you're not looking at it with the right tools, but the connections that remain grow larger, and they get wrapped in this fatty insulating tissue that we call myelin. And the combination of those two things makes signal conduction, which is electrical, much, much faster, right? So we've gone from a series of like thin wires, really can just pick up any piece of information in the environment and start to grab onto it, to like a highway, an information superhighway in older people. That's going to be associated with proficiency at different skills. Now, the stages that I just described to you of brain development always happen in the same order, but they happen in different parts of the brain at different ages and different stages. Really, that is what causes the developmental stages that we recognize. So this is a slide of MRI, functional MRI pictures that were taken of brains of people at different ages. And what you're seeing here is that in the greens and reds, you're seeing immature brain, and in the blues, you're seeing mature brain. And what I want to point out here is that this brain maturation, it's not random or haphazard. It actually has a very orderly progression, generally speaking, from the back of the brain to the front, right? Different areas maturing at different times. And the other thing I want to point out is that the oldest individuals in this study were 20 years old. And if you can see this, there's still a fair bit of green tissue in the 20-year-old brain. And this process is really thought to be complete somewhere in the mid-20s for most people. Now, my first specialty was actually in developmental behavioral pediatrics, and I became interested in how brain maturation correlates with the behaviors that we expect to see of children at different developmental stages. And it turns out that, not surprisingly, but, it was a glorious discovery, even though it's not really surprising, these map perfectly, right? And so the easiest place I can show you that is in the cerebellum, which is the part of the brain all the way in the back that's responsible for the coordination of gross motor skills. Now, this part of the brain develops in the first year or two of life, and that is happening just at the time when children are learning to walk. In fact, pediatricians, we all call this stage toddlerhood, right? Because walking is so important. It's such a focus of the day of young children, right? And you can actually imagine how this feedback loop is working, right? The brain maturation gets to a certain point, the baby stands up. Standing up is actually sending signals back up to the brain. The brain is going to refine the neural architecture. Babies are going to take their first steps. Again, more feedback. The feedback actually sends more information down to, coordinate the limbs. And you get this beautiful feedback loop. And then, within a year, by the age of 18 months or so, you've got a really proficient walker, right? And that part of the brain is completely developed. Now, it gets the brain is obviously a complex organ, and things get a little bit more complicated, but we can still see glimpses of this in older ages and other developmental stages as well. So for example, in the preschool years, one of the parts of the brain that's undergoing rapid development is called the amygdala, and that's involved in emotional regulation. And that's happening just at the time that we sometimes call the terrible twos, right? We know that young children of this age, they have these temper tantrums. They seem to be unprovoked. And they also resolve without too much intervention, right? I mean, these are just tantrums that kind of come out of nowhere and go back. And that's really completely normal for children who are in this preschool age. And those temper tantrums are happening just as the amygdala is maturing, right? When little things are provoking, this kind of emotional outburst, that'll eventually go away. In fact, it should be going away right as children enter the school age years, right? I mean, there's a reason that we put children in kindergarten around age 5, because most people around age 5 are going to be leaving this stage. And those tantrums are going to become much less frequent and much more likely to be sort of provoked, right? Now, in the school age years, the nucleus accumbens, which is also sometimes called the pleasure and reward center of the brain, is undergoing rapid development. Now, it's this part of the brain that's jammed with dopamine receptors, right? That signal pleasure, signal that something good has happened. And this is the time in life, while this is maturing, that children are learning to differentiate between important rewards and unimportant rewards, and this helps to develop goal-directed behavior. And I'm going to show you more about that in just a minute. And then the last part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of executive functions, right? Those are the things that help us make good decisions, like self-monitoring, error correction, and impulse control. And they're becoming proficient during adolescence. Now, it doesn't mean that adolescents can't make good decisions. They sometimes do. It just means that their decision-making skills are not yet proficient, right? Okay. So in this model, we can describe adolescence as the period of time after the nucleus accumbens is, or which, that pleasure and reward center, which you can think of as the gas pedal of behavior, is fully developed, but the prefrontal cortex or the behavioral brakes are still maturing. Okay? So, in other words, another way of putting this is that adolescents' brains respond differently to rewards compared to both young children and adults. And this is a complex slide that's describing the results of an experiment, but it's an important slide because it demonstrates this beautifully, and it's worth going through just a little bit. So in this experiment, researchers brought in participants of different ages, and they gave them rewards of different sizes, and they measured what was happening in their pleasure and reward center, right? That part of their brain. They measured cell firing in that part of their brain as they were receiving the reward, okay? Now, if you look at the left, I want you to look at the light blue line on top. This is the youngest children. They're school-age children. And you can see that whether they received a small reward on the left or a large reward on the right, the brain fires roughly the same amount. It's almost impossible to tell the difference between those two, right? So what does that mean? That children are not particularly good at discriminating between important rewards and unimportant rewards, right? Now, if you've ever taken a child to the pediatrician, you may have noticed that they're all giving out stickers as rewards, right? Why stickers? Because a sticker is as good a reward as just about anything else for young children. When we tell young children that something is a reward, it will serve as a reward. Now look at the green lines. These are the adults. And on the left, you can see that when an adult receives a reward, they get a small blip in firing. When they receive a large reward, they get a large blip in firing, right? So it's a proportional response. It's kind of what you probably would predict. Now look at the black line. These are the adolescents. I want you to notice that when adolescents receive a small reward, their brain actually deactivates below baseline. So, this is telling us that for adolescents, receiving a small reward is actually unpleasant, right? And anybody who knows an adolescent well, who's lived with an adolescent or has spent time with adolescents, know this, right? If you offer your adolescent a very small reward, right, like a pencil or a sticker, you're probably going to get some form of an eye roll, right? They're not going to be pleased or excited about it, right? Now, look what happens with large rewards, though, right? With large rewards, adolescents' brains fire off the scale, right? They fire much more than adults or young children. And in fact, the number of dopamine receptors, the concentration of dopamine receptors is highest during adolescence, right? So they are all about finding things that are going to deliver large rewards. That is a developmental drive for this age group. And actually, that is the problem when it comes to substance use. So this is a slide from NIDA, and it's reminding us that all psychoactive substances feel good through the same final common pathway, right? And that is dopamine firing in the pleasure and reward center. Now, in a sense, what these substances are doing is that they're hijacking normal reward pathways, right? So instead of, if you're hungry and you eat something, you're going to get some firing in the pleasure and reward center of your brain. But it's not direct. There's no receptor for a peanut butter sandwich in your brain that's going to trigger dopamine release, right? It's going to go through a long, complicated series, pathway that's eventually going to result in a little bit of firing. But if you use cannabis, marijuana, or cocaine or heroin or alcohol or any other psychoactive substance for that matter, it's going to bind to the neurons in your brain pretty directly, trigger that dopamine firing, right? So that's like a hijacking of the system. And, there's nothing about this that's natural, and there's nothing about this that's healthy, but it is going to fulfill a developmental drive for adolescents. And it explains why adolescents are developmentally vulnerable to substance use. If we make substances available, if we allow them, if we promote them, if we tell people that they're okay, it's the adolescents in our communities who are most likely to use them, right? I mean, it's actually a basic biological tenet, right? This is the part of the population that's really looking for those very large, very rewarding, rewarding in the sense of dopamine release activities. And this is actually empiric data from the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration. And it demonstrates that the peak age for substance use initiation is somewhere between 14 and 20. And by 26, substance use initiation is actually pretty rare. So people who don't start using a substance in their teens or early adulthood are actually unlikely to ever start using it and very unlikely to ever develop a disorder. There are some exceptions. But a real live case example is what happened with these nicotine vapes and Juul. And I know you're going to have a whole talk on cannabis and nicotine and Juul coming up, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But suffice it to say that although the claim was that these products were made for adults, in fact, they were not appealing to adults. And these days I've actually spoken to lots of adults who were curious about these products, but they were not non-smokers who were curious about these products, who actually didn't like them at all. They were rather aversive to them, right? That's because the age of initiation, the age when we're really going to be interested in that blast of dopamine, has actually passed by the time you get to adulthood. Now, there's another point I want to make here too, and that is that adolescents are not only more prone to try substances, but they're also developmentally vulnerable to develop substance use disorders. This is, okay, so back to this slide to remind us that substance use is pleasurable because it triggers dopamine release in that pleasure and reward center. When you do that enough, right, exogenously, not through the normal pathways, but when you kind of hijack the system enough times, we start seeing changes in that part of the brain, in that nucleus accumbens. And those changes can dramatically affect behavior and cause a loss of control over substance use, right? Those changes can cause the brain to kind of misfile the drug use as if it were a life-sustaining behavior. And when that happens, people lose control of their substance use. The higher centers in their brain are taken over by these lower, kind of more primal parts of the brain to adjust their behavior to get a substance when it's not easily available to them. And that is a picture that we call addiction, right? So if you keep using substances to trigger that part of your brain, you're at risk of developing the neurologic changes that are associated with the behaviors that we call addiction. Now, in older people, those mature prefrontal cortexes are actually seem to be able to protect the nucleus accumbens, that pleasure and reward center. But teens, because their prefrontal cortexes are not yet fully developed, they kind of lack that hard shell that adults have developed, and that leaves them more vulnerable to developing substance use disorders. And in fact, for every psychoactive substance, the earlier use is initiated, the more likely a person is to develop a substance use disorder. The graph on the left is showing that teens that have their first intoxication before age 13 have about a 50-50 chance of developing an alcohol use disorder, and that of course falls greatly. People who become intoxicated but for the first time after their 21st birthday have less than a 10% chance of developing an alcohol use disorder. Same is true for cannabis, roughly the same, 4 to 5-fold increase. This is a very old slide, and I will tell you that I think that these numbers are really quite low, and this work was done with a different form of cannabis, a much less potent form of cannabis that was available in the late 80s and early 90s. All right, now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk more specifically about marijuana or cannabis. And here on the right in purple, you're looking at a 3D diagram of THC. which is a chemical that's made by the cannabis plant, and is, of course, the active ingredient in cannabis. On the left in teal, you have a picture of anandamide, which is a neurotransmitter that's made by the human body, showing the 3D diagrams because they look kind of similar. And in fact, THC is able to bind to cannabinoid receptors throughout the central nervous system. And when they bind there, they are actually mimicking the anandamide, right? They're causing the cells to fire in the same way that the anandamide would cause cells to fire, and it's going to cause all of the physiologic effects that anandamide would cause. Now, this is a schematic of the brain that's showing areas that are rich in cannabinoid receptors. And when we look at those areas and understand what functions of the brain are supported by these areas, you can get a sense of what cannabis use is gonna do, right? So now the area in the center that's really the most lit up is that nucleus accumbens, right? That's the pleasure and reward center, and that's, cannabis is going to trigger dopamine firing, and that's really what's rewarding about cannabis use. If you remember, this area in the back is called the cerebellum, and it's important for gross motor coordination, and you can see it's actually pretty rich in cannabinoid receptors. And so you can guess from that, and you'd be right, that cannabis use is going to impact our motor coordination. Other areas that are rich in cannabinoid receptors include this structure in the middle, which is called the hippocampus. Some ancient Greek anatomists thought it looked like a seahorse. And that is a part of the brain that is involved in long-term memory formation, as in very important for learning. So you can see that cannabis is going to impact memory and learning. And then take a look at those prefrontal cortexes. They're also loaded with cannabis receptors, and you can guess from this diagram that that cannabis is going to interfere with executive functioning. Now, this cartoon shows what happens when either THC or anandamide bind to the cannabinoid receptor. So cannabinoid binding actually suppresses cell signaling. And so basically it's stopping cells from releasing chemical transmitters. It's stopping cells from sending messages to their neighbors. So basically it's telling the cells, shh, quiet down, stop firing, right? There's a difference between THC and anandamide, and that is that THC is actually a little bit stickier to the receptor, so it actually will outcompete if both are in the synapse. It's like a stronger magnet being pulled over to a board. It's going to be pulled over a little stronger, and it's going to sit there a little longer. That's a problem because we know this cannabinoid system is very important in guiding brain development. And so if instead of having the anandamide that we're supposed to have, like doing the signaling, that your body is sort of programmed to do, we're interfering with that by throwing THC into the mix, it can cause problems. I mean, basically what we're doing is when we're doing all that pruning, instead of pruning with a fine surgical scalpel as an analogy, we're now pruning with a sledgehammer, right? Because we're using the anandamide instead of the THC. And this is just a slide showing the correlation between the size of the hippocampus, right? That structure that's so important for memory and learning. You're looking at the size of the hippocampus on the x-axis and the total number of cannabis used on the y-axis. Again, this is a relatively old slide. This was published more than 10 years ago, and done before it was published, probably done in the early 2000s. But what you see is that the more cannabis you use, the smaller your hippocampus likely is to be, right? And so there's questions about what's going on with development there, and is there some over pruning, right? I think that there's some unknowns about that, but we're starting to put all of the pieces of this together, right? Now, So the hippocampus is important in learning and memory function and things that go into, an IQ. And this is a study that was done early in, also in the 2010s. This is a longitudinal cohort study that was done in New Zealand, where researchers wanted to understand the functional outcomes of cannabis use over time. So they recruited a cohort of 13-year-old children, and they followed them every 3 to 5 years or so. And every time point that they caught up with them, they administered participants an extensive assessment battery that included, among other things, questions about whether they were using cannabis currently, and if so, they asked them questions about how much they were using and whether they had developed a disorder. And they also had a psychodiagnostic interview and a full-scale IQ test. And so what did they see? So what they saw is that you're looking at change in IQ over time amongst people with different histories of cannabis use, right? And so on the bottom, so we don't expect IQ to change much over time. IQ is thought to be stable. It's just a stable facet of persona. You can see that if you look at the bottom, you're looking at the never users, their IQ did not change. The changes that, looks like that you can ask, is that a positive change? No, it's like not statistically significant. But if you compare the never users to the people who 3 or more times met diagnostic criteria for cannabis use disorder, what you see is that there's a very significant drop in IQ. It's about 6 points. Now, 6 points is not something that you would pick up. Just you wouldn't know just by speaking to somebody that maybe if they had a 6-point IQ fault. But what's really important here is that it's pointing out to us that, hey, there's something that looks like it's a little toxic going on in the brain of adolescents who are using cannabis. And we know from lots of other research that as a group, these folks do less well. They're less likely to finish school, get married, have children, have a stable job, or have a career than their peers who don't use cannabis. And cannabis use during adolescence is also strongly associated with psychotic disorders. This slide shows the results of a meta-analysis showing that cannabis use doubled the risk of developing a psychotic disorder. This work was done in 2007. Cannabis-induced psychosis has become, very common amongst the kids I've seen. It's been over the course of my career, which is about 25 years, it's just become increasingly common. This is a slide that I pulled out that was looking at the association between cannabis use and schizoaffective disorder, psychotic disorder. I pulled it out for this reason. Because a lot of the kids tell me, well, I only use cannabis once in a while, and so I just don't really worry about, those problems. I think those problems happen in people who use more. And it is true that there's this dose-dependent effect. So the more you use, the more likely you are to get side effects. But what I tell people is that it's just like what we tell pregnant women about alcohol. There's no known safe level of alcohol use during pregnancy, and there's no known safe level of cannabis use during adolescence. This is a study that was done in Sweden, where they have a mandatory army service. So they can look at the entire population. What they found in this study is that when they looked at people who they defined as high-risk users, so people who reported 50 or more cannabis use times in their lifetime, they were 7 times more likely to have a psychotic disorder compared to never users. Now, this 50 times sounds kind of like a lot of times for a young person, a young adult. But, if you think about being in high school for 4 years, that's roughly once a month during your high school years, right? And so, just to kind of strengthen the point, there is no known safe limit. And this slide it comes from work from my own group at Boston Children's Hospital. We recruited 500 kids who were coming in for routine primary care, not for substance use disorder treatment, but routine primary care. Of those, about 30% told us that they had used cannabis in the past year at least once. Of that group, more than a quarter had experienced an hallucination when we asked them, and about a third had experienced paranoia or anxiety. Now, taken together, more than 40% had experienced at least one psychotic symptom while they were using cannabis. None of these kids had a psychotic disorder. None of them were even diagnosed with cannabis-induced psychosis because these problems never made it to light. They were answered on an anonymous survey, and they were not evaluated to see if, to get more information from them. This has never been studied before, but it's our speculation that the increasing the increasing potency of cannabis products and the delivery devices that also increases their potency is making all of these untoward side effects of cannabis use more common. So for these reasons, the American Academy of Pediatrics encourages parents to really give clear messages to their adolescent children, saying that they don't approve of teen cannabis use. And this is really critically important because adolescents are constantly surrounded by pro-cannabis messages, stemming primarily from industry that has a vested interest in selling THC products. So it's critically important that trusted adults, and parents are number one on that list, counteract those messages with factual information. Right now, I would say in some ways we're losing the battle. This is data from a national study of kids in school that's looking at substance use among 10th graders, and this study was done in 2019. And what you can see is that in the 5-year period from 2015 to 2019, you can see that the slopes of alcohol use, cigarette use, and drug use are all up, which means that up is good because we're looking at non-use, right?
Very medical at the beginning, talk about the brain development.
Sorry if folks don't mind muting.
Please mute yourself, folks. Thank you.
So just to orient folks, so on the y-axis we're seeing rates of non-use. So these are kids who have never used any of these substances. So any line that goes up is good, and you can see that most lines are going up, right? Where we are actually reducing the rates of alcohol use and the rates of tobacco smoking. Vaping, of course, is an exception that in 2018 and 2019 was a real exception. But if you look at cannabis, you see we're moving in the wrong direction, right? And that's like a standout. I mean, other than vaping, which is actually tied to cannabis use, it's really a standout. Like, we're seeing kids use less substances, but we're not really making as much progress as cannabis is with the others. Okay. So lots of concerns about marijuana, but there are also lots of things that parents can do about them, and some of them are very simple. So I thought I'd spend the last third of this talk really just going over those. So the first thing is setting clear limits and letting your kids know simply and in clear language that you disapprove of teen cannabis use. There's good evidence that teens who think their parents disapprove of use are less likely to use, and even if they do use, will use less. Now, at times, it may seem like you're swimming upstream, because if your neighborhood is anything like mine, you're seeing billboards for the nearest cannabis dispensary on every single corner, and your kids may tell you that they know everything there is to know about cannabis because they've learned it on social media. And what they know about it is that it's harmless or maybe even medically good for you. Remember that parents are among the few sources who can provide the counterbalance to all of this messaging, right? So it's really important to stay on message. And hopefully parents can understand that curiosity about cannabis is normal. And so, and with that frame of mind, allow them to approach conversations without anger or angst, right? here's a piece of good news. Research that was conducted by my team found that teen cannabis use is a behavior that's actually more easily changed and discouraged than teen alcohol use is, right? So teens are, from the work we've done with over 5,000 teens in schools in Massachusetts, we saw that discouraging their cannabis use actually had a bigger impact even than discouraging alcohol use, because probably because alcohol is so entrenched and accepted that even by the time a kid is a teen, their ideas are pretty fixed about alcohol, but there's still a little wiggle room about marijuana. So remember that your teens will hear a lot of information on regular media, on social media, and some of it may be accurate. But no matter how much they hear, most kids will still have questions. So be open to hearing your teens' questions. Answer them honestly, non-judgmentally. If you don't know the answer, look it up together. Show them how to use good sources on the internet, or ask a professional. Somebody once asked me, what's the right amount to talk to your kids about, drug use? And I said, I don't know what the right amount is, but I'll tell you as a parent personally, I think I hit a special bar with that because, my kids actually got bored of the topic, right? And I think they were some of the only kids maybe in the United States who would roll their eyes when the topic turned to drugs because they found it boring. Oh yeah, Mom, we've heard it all already. I think that's what you want. You want them to find the topic boring. So it's really important to share information with your teen. So genetics play a really big role in who's going to develop a substance use disorder and who's not. And in general, people, and even young people and teenagers, are actually very attuned to genetic risk. It's something that really moderates behavior more than some other pieces of information. So if someone in your family has a substance use disorder, consider about whether and how you might explain genetic risk and what that means to your kids. Oh, as with everything, it's really important to set a good example for your kids. Cannabis is legal in a lot of states, although, it's, in this quasi-legal area, but in a lot of states it's legal, it's out in the open. If you do use cannabis, do so in moderation, never drive while you're impaired. And even if you're using cannabis, encourage your kids, discourage, disapprove of teen cannabis use. Tell your kids that if they do want to try, wait until they're older. Spend a lot of time at the beginning explaining why their brains are different and the impacts are much more significant. And that really makes a difference. If your kids ask a direct question about your own personal history and whether you used in the past, I encourage parents to answer honestly, but decide what you'll share. You don't have to tell them everything, right? Hold back stories that seem to glorify drug use. And if you would wish you had made other decisions at other points in your life, tell them honestly. So parents who use substances during their adolescence can tell their children how they think about those decisions now that they're an adult. You don't need to share every story from your youth. And you can, and even if there are things that you did but you wish they don't and would like to save them from, tell them about it. Just as if they asked you, did you ever ride in a car without a seatbelt? Even if you did, you think that it's a good idea for them not to. So parents can create rules around teen socialization. Now, adolescents are going to pick their own friends. They should, but parents really can set the ground rules. So if your child wants to go out with friends, you should understand what their plans are. So you want to ask a few questions. Who will your kids be with? What will they be where will you be going? What will you be doing? Where will you be, and how will you get home? Kids should be able to answer all of those questions, and they're not particularly invasive. Parents should set a reasonable curfew that matches their kids' plans. If your kid is going to have a sleepover, I really encourage you to speak with the parents. That gives you an opportunity to share your house rules, your rules for your child, and your expectations. So this is on the flip side of things. It's important for adolescents to have opportunities to participate in activities that deliver natural brain reward, right? Adolescents do need brain reward. And the more we can find activities that deliver it naturally, the more we can pull them away from drug use. There are just a lot of ways to get there, hobbies, work, volunteering, community service, sports, dance. I mean, it's the key for parents is, just simply putting as many opportunities in front of your adolescent as possible. Don't push. They'll decide the ones they want. They're going to do the ones they want. The more you push, the more uncool you might make it. But just make them available, right? Offer them. Tell them that, if it's possible, tell them that you'll pay for an exercise class, or or you'll give them a ride to a school activity, or whatever it is that you can do. I really encourage parents to watch for mental health symptoms. So anxiety and depression are two-way streets with cannabis use. Kids with underlying mental health problems are much more likely to grab for cannabis than kids who don't have those. And kids who use marijuana are much more likely to develop those symptoms. If you're seeing signs of anxiety or depression, take it seriously, get professional help, get it treated. Treating mental health symptoms can reduce drug use. Just like treating drug use can reduce mental health symptoms. So, keep an eye out for those and do what you can. And then finally, I'm going to just end with a last word about driving. So if you have teen children, you've probably heard them say, "I got this," even though you don't got that, right? I mean, we've all seen it, like, it's developmentally normal. I mean, the evolution has made adolescents kind of overestimate their own skills and capabilities, and there's a good reason for that, because if every adolescent had a very accurate self-appraisal, they'd probably never leave their parents' home, right? So giving them a little extra bravado right around the time that they're going to leave home makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, it can also get them into trouble, and driving is one of the big places where that can really be an issue. So if your kid is learning to drive, I can't tell you how many times I hear, "I know when I'm safe to drive." And unfortunately, that's unhealthy overconfidence speaking, and parents really need to intervene. Everything we know about cannabis in the brain tells us that it would interfere with driving, and in fact, the empiric research bears that out. And in fact, not only does using cannabis increase the risk of getting into a car crash, the risk lasts much, much longer than the period where people actually feel like they're high. And remember that cannabis is fat soluble, and it stays in your body, and in all that fatty tissue in your brain, it stays right there. It's very close to where those neurons are. So for teens, driving performance remains impaired well after the high wears off. I strongly urge parents to set a firm limit. No driving if you're using cannabis. If your child has been using cannabis frequently, consider having them do a drug test to ensure it's cleared their system before handing over the car keys. It's just that important. Some things you don't want to happen even once. And on that happy note, I will end there. I want to thank you for your attention. And I'm showing you a picture of our Division of Addiction Medicine and a recent research seminar. If you liked what you heard and want to hear some of it repeated, but and then more depth and more topics, please do listen to my audiobook. You can see the website there, and I believe it's also posted on the Be Part of the Conversation website. So with that, again, I will thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
I know there was a question about how do you talk to a young adult about cannabis use if they're already using, and I know you're a pediatrician and that's your wheelhouse, but I'd love to know if you have any thoughts about that, like kind of beyond that. We parents think, if we have an under 18-year-old, we think, well, what can we do? They're in our home, we are limited. And then if they're over 18, what can we do? They're not a kid anymore. But there probably are some things we can do.
Yeah, I think there are. I'll start with over 18s actually, because 18 is this big legal landmark. It's not. I mean, we know developmental landmarks don't happen from one day to the next, but legal landmarks do. You have your birthday, you're 18. I think that the real issue here is that the 18-year-old who the day after his birthday storms down and says, "Well, I'm not going to follow your rules anymore because I'm 18 now and there's nothing you can do about it." Is really asking for all the privileges or the authority of adulthood without any of the responsibilities, and that formula doesn't work, right? And so what I would say is, regardless of whether your child is, 14 or 18 or 25, you have the right to set up house rules for your house, and everybody living in your home has to follow them regardless of their age. So that is for starters. One thing that I'll point out about cannabis is look, if your child's become addicted to cannabis, demanding that they become abstinent overnight is really essentially an impossible task, right? So, don't set them up for failure like that, right? So you're going to have to think about ways to compromise. One of the things that I recommend for parents of for older or younger patients, if we think that your child has probably lost control of their cannabis use, we're going to shift focus, right? I mean, we want to be, here's where we want to be sort of understanding that there's a medical underpinning to the behavior that we're seeing. And at the same time, we don't want to just excuse it, right? So, I suggest that parents maintain a drug-free home, right? Which means you're not allowed to use cannabis in my house. But, maybe you might be willing to turn a blind eye, in your backyard or your garage or something, right? What you're doing with that is you're keeping your message like, I don't allow this in my house. I don't approve of it. And at the same time, trying to be understanding that it may not be possible for you to control the use right now, but you're making it less convenient, right? It's a cold night, it's raining, whatever, I don't care. That's like that, and that actually has an impact on discouraging it. The other thing at that point is we want to really focus on getting a child or an adolescent or a young adult engaged in treatment. So, again, you can't necessarily insist that they stop right away, but you can insist that they start, seeing a behavioral health counselor, start working on the problem, right? And then you want to flip to kind of rewarding the cooperation, the engagement, the trying, like I'm really trying my best, and understanding that the results may trail a little bit on that.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, let me answer very generally that eating disorders and substance use disorders very frequently co-occur, right? And so, we have a lot of patients with eating disorders in our substance use disorder program, in fact, sometimes treated with the same medications, right? So, there's something, there's probably some commonality in the brain that's, between them.
If you as the adult are prescribed medical marijuana, how do you properly explain to your 13-year-old that it's okay for you, but not for them?
So, this is a question that really comes up all the time, right? If you are, I think any medication that you're using as a prescription, you would not expect your children to use, right? If you had a surgery and were prescribed opioids and are using them as a medication to treat a certain condition, you would not necessarily say that it's okay for your kids to use an opioid. And I would treat this the same way. It's like, I'm working with a healthcare professional, and this is the treatment course that I've been recommended, and this is what I'm doing, but that's just not the same for you, right? And again, really focus on the using marijuana when you're 13 is really very different, because of brain development than using it when you're older. Just 13-year-olds don't do all the things that adults do. They don't drive cars, right? We're typically very comfortable telling our 13-year-olds they shouldn't drink alcohol, right? Because societally it's much more accepted that they shouldn't, right? That like we've set those barriers a little bit better. I think it's still developing with cannabis, but I think for parents, you got to hold the line.
And wouldn't it be fair too to say that we really don't have enough research about the impact on higher potency, especially depending on what kind of medical marijuana is being recommended for the adult? Some of those higher potencies are just not, you cited that New Zealand study. I think that was done in what, 2012 or even
It was
earlier.
published in 2012, so it was done well before that. We've followed people for
Right.
30 years, so it's like done in the 80s.
So we're not talking about 75% THC. We're talking about something much, much lower potency. And what unfortunately many young people are drawn to these days are those higher potency products that are in vape pens and dabbing and all that sort of thing. And so I hope that people understand that, depending on what they're getting from a medical marijuana dispensary, it might be very low, it might be higher in CBD and lower in THC, but we just don't know enough. And even CBD can have some impact on the liver, isn't that correct? If that's a higher.
CBD, all of these substances have side effects, actually, right? And so, yes, especially in high doses. And again, like if you're really treating it, if you're treating this as a medication, we don't expect our kids to we don't just say, well, I'm using this as a prescription medication, so you can use it too. We don't do that for anything else. So I would just use the same logic here. Yeah, so that's a great question. Congratulations to your son. You're still quite young. I want to say, as a physician, I would never comment on a patient's condition or prognosis, who's not in my care. But I will just say very generally that young people, have remarkable resilience and regenerative powers, right? That's one of the things about that's the flip side. It's like they're susceptible, at the same time they're they have rejuvenative powers that really more so than adults. So yeah, I don't know what his details are, but I think that uh, that he may well get better in a number of domains over time.
I would just want to say also that I remember when my
Yeah.
son was in early recovery, he was 21, 22, and he was foggy and his mind was not the same for months and months and months and maybe even years. But then I am happy to say that it did come back. He finished college, he went to graduate school, but it took time. There was no doubt about it.
Yeah, so this there really is no brain scan that's clinically useful at this point, right? So we're addiction medicine is still very much like psychiatry, where diagnoses are made by conversations and having patients report their experiences and their issues. What I would say is if your child is not getting treatment, super, stick with it, right? That's what I would say. Like it's often not quick, but stick with it. Um, really, my uh, the issue that comes up a lot in my practice is that, kids who've been using cannabis for a long time or drugs for a long time, whatever the substance is, they just get so much negative feedback from the world around them, right? Including, often including family members, because it's like, oh, they just are disappointed or frustrated or whatever the issues are. So find things that you can give him praise for. And even if it's, you scheduled that appointment on your own and you went to it, you got there on time. Like, I'm really happy that you're, like anything that you can do, even small things, with a focus on keeping him engaged and in treatment and going. Cause the one thing I would say we know about treatment is that it works. It almost doesn't matter which treatment you choose. They all work if you stick with them.
All right, we have a couple of questions in the chat. How can you tell if someone is addicted to marijuana use?
So just as I just mentioned, substance use disorders are really diagnosed by patient history. So you really need an experienced clinician to sit down and take a good history and really understand the impacts of substance use as told by the person who's using marijuana, right? And that sometimes, if you're thinking, oh, my kid won't tell you everything, probably right. I've been doing this work for 25 years, so sometimes it takes a little bit of time to sort those things out. But usually once you get to know somebody, it sorts itself out pretty well. But if your addiction is really talking about loss of control over substance use, right? Remember that people who are addicted can forego use on any given occasion, right? So, if I'm an addicted smoker, but I'm sitting in the movie theater and no smoking is allowed, I might be able to, I might have a craving for smoking, for a cigarette, but be able to kind of stave it off. And then probably as soon as I get out, right, that's when I will light up. So it's not that you have zero control. It's that control is difficult and takes a lot of mental energy, right? I have to think about, I actually have the natural state once you become addicted is to sort of just naturally reach for it and pop it in your mouth. And to not do that, to override that, actually takes a lot of mental energy and can be really exhausting. If you think you're seeing that, you're probably seeing signs of an addiction.
Here's a question. How do you convince your 18-year-old that they actually have a THC addiction and need to seek treatment if they don't think that they do? He also has a history of mental health issues, depression, anxiety that are a contributing factor. And in his mind, the THC vaping is therapeutic. However, as his parents, we know that THC usage is very detrimental. This is such a common thing that we hear come up.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. One of the issues is that so many people who use cannabis find it therapeutic, and that notion is actually supported. Well, for one thing, if you have anxiety and you use cannabis, you're going to feel a little better immediately, right? It's going to relieve anxiety acutely. The problem is that it's going to worsen the anxiety disorder over time. It's just like if you have pain and you use heroin, it'll take the pain right away, but if you continue to use heroin, you become hypersensitive to pain. It's the same kind of thing, right? So, it's easy to see what's happening in the short term. What do you mean? I use marijuana, I feel better right away, right? And not appreciate what's happening in the long term. What I would say is, I wouldn't try and convince him, honestly. I think we rarely convince anybody of anything. The only person who's going to convince him is himself. And so, I would ask him or insist perhaps that he speak to a mental health provider, right? And, a skilled mental health provider will really not so much try and convince him of anything, but really rather elicit, his understanding and, help him kind of convince himself of the role of cannabis in his life or what it's doing to his mental health.
Great. Thank you. Here's another question. When do you recommend inpatient drug use of cannabis for the young adult? Are there different success rates with different treatments?
That's a great question. I'm just actually going to make a little distinction between residential care, which is what I think you're talking about, versus inpatient care. So inpatient care is really referring to either medical or psychiatric hospitalization. And inpatient care comes when someone is really at risk of medical consequences, like somebody who's withdrawing from alcohol, for example, someone who's been a very heavy drinker and needs to be medically managed, or somebody who has, a psychosis and is at risk of harming themselves or somebody else. That would be, those are inpatient programs. Residential treatment is different. Residential treatment is a higher level of care for substance use disorders that really allows people to get intense services. So a lot of individual therapy, a lot of group therapy. I think a good program will have, family therapy as well. They'll bring the family in and have family therapy. And they can do it intensively because they have the patients 24/7 for a couple of weeks. Determining level of care it depends on many factors, right? I've seen a lot of kids who I felt like, you could certainly benefit from a residential level of care, but really they're voluntary programs. So, they're only useful for people who want to go to them. Now, if you have a child who's saying, I really need help and is looking for help and is willing to go to a residential treatment, it certainly might be the best place to go. For people who say, I cannot stop using drugs in my house because everything in my bedroom triggers me, or I step outside of the house and everybody in the neighborhood, I use cannabis, I just can't do it, right? Or, for people who, if there's somebody with an active substance use disorder in the home, making it hard for people in that situation who are saying, look, I really need help, I want to do this, residential is a place that makes a whole lot of sense. It can also be a good place for stabilization for people who have co-occurring disorders. If they have substance use problems and they have, pretty severe depression, they really need treatment for both. Residential might be the right place for them. People don't want to go to residential treatment. Use it as a place of negotiation, right? Like if they say, look, I'll get treatment, but I'm not sleeping in a program, right? Okay, well, let's do an intensive outpatient program. Let's see, if you're willing to do treatment, I'll take it. You don't want to sleep there? Okay, we'll start with one where you sleep at home. But the main point is not the level of care, but that you have somebody who's willing to do treatment. So take what you can get and then monitor them. And, if they're, maybe that'll be enough. Maybe now that they're saying, okay, I'll go to treatment, maybe that'll really do the trick. If not, if they're still struggling or it's not working for them, you can always consider, a higher level of care and time, right? So then you can reevaluate.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you work much with families where, and I encounter this quite a bit when I'm talking to parents, where one parent is very concerned about their child's cannabis use, and the other parent is like, I did that in college, I grew out of it, it's going to be fine. And then the child is getting some mixed messages. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that alignment of the co-parenting.
It's really challenging, right? I see that a lot. It's particularly common with divorced parents, but I see it in married parents as well. We did a study that I briefly mentioned. We surveyed more than 5,000 kids who are in a public school in Massachusetts, right, all over the state. And one of the questions we asked was, what do your parents think about teen marijuana use? And it was a multiple choice question, and the first choice was, my parents disapprove. And then we had, 4 or 5 more choices, like they think it's not that bad as long as I'm careful, or my parents disagree, or I don't know what my parents think, or, they would prefer, but they don't really care. We gave them like a lot of options of things that kids will say to us. So, was roughly 10% of, like 90% of the kids chose that first option, right? And 10%, were split, right? There was no clear winner among the other options. And, needless to say, that 10%, that had most of the cannabis users in the group, right in that 10%. So those two things really go together. What I find really fascinating is that when families come to my program, I interview the patient, young person, And I ask them, so what do your parents say about cannabis use? And they'll say, well, they don't like it, but they say they know that as long as they don't get in trouble, they think it's not that big of a deal. And then I interview the parents, and that's not really what they're intending to say to their child at all. They're saying, no, I don't approve and I want him to stop. But they haven't said that clearly, or they haven't said it explicitly, and the message is just not being picked up. So I do think that there are a lot of parents who feel like, look, it's just normal for people to do this. I would encourage that parent to speak to a healthcare provider and really kind of understand the issues as I presented them tonight, if possible, or to read or listen to the audiobook, right? I mean, just to, kind of hear these things. I would also encourage parents who disapprove of cannabis use to make sure that they're transmitting that message very clearly to their kids.
Right. Yes. And if you have that information published, I would love to be able to share that with our family members, because I think that is such a, that 90% piece, that is huge, to help drive that message, that your messaging needs to be clear, needs to be emphatic. And I know that we encounter this a lot too, where we want to be careful in our messaging about that. Like, yes, very clear that we don't approve, but would you agree that, we don't want to become too hyperbolic about it, because if they love this thing and we're saying it's the worst thing that ever came, and we're really very, very, very negative about it, we're going to drive them further underground, I guess is where I'm going to with that.
Yeah, I get asked about, how important is honesty in the relationship, if that's what you're asking. I think it's important that parents are not hyperbolic, right? I don't think you need to say, cannabis is the worst thing on earth. Hyperbole, people, if young children believe it, as soon as they get to be adolescents and see it and try it for themselves, they'll say, what was she talking about? She's got it all wrong, right? I think hyperbole is never really helpful, right? I think that, right. So, just really honest conversations, right, is, where I think you want to stay. Driving it underground, I don't know. I get asked about that a lot. Like, I have parents who say, well, yeah, my kid uses marijuana every day, but he tells me about it, so I know about it, so I feel okay about it because I know about it. I'm like, not sure that, they're afraid to set a limit. 'Cause if I set a limit, my child will stop talking to me. I would set the limit, right? Having your child report their cannabis use to you is not really benefiting them. And I think parents don't need to worry about monitoring their kid. Evolution did us some favors as parents. They made it really easy for us to monitor our kids, right? I think most people on here, the call, are parents, right? How many of you have come down to the kitchen first thing in the morning and have seen the cereal box open and milk spilt on the counter and a dirty bowl and spoon in the sink, and turned to your child and said, did you have a midnight snack last night? And your child says, well, how on earth did you know? Right? I mean, basically, they're just not good at covering their tracks, right? And so, if your kid is using cannabis and this has really been an issue, I think that there are other ways of monitoring them, that you don't really need them to self-report, and the reassurance that, well, he's so honest with me and I value that in our relationship. It may be a little bit misplaced if it's too far in one direction.
Right. Thank you for that. That's great thoughts. We're going to do one more question. I see, as an educator who is aware of an increase in cannabis use among our middle school population, I'm concerned that our school needs to do more to deter drug use. What are your suggestions?
It's a great question. So, in Massachusetts, where I live, the state passed a law, it's a number of years ago now, saying that all schools are required to do to offer screening and brief intervention for students twice between middle school and high school, right? And so basically, every single school in the state brings kids in one by one, has them, ask them some screening questions about drug use and then gives them information. So my group, my research group, decided, did an evaluation of that program. So we recruited, I think 35 schools in more than 20 districts. And we surveyed kids, and we surveyed them before they had that screening and brief intervention, right, with the nurse, and then we screened them 3 months, and then we surveyed them 3 months later. And we, so we use schools that, although schools are mandated to do screening and brief intervention, they can choose the grades. So we considered your school a control if we were looking at 8th graders and you did your screening in 9th grade, we considered your school a control. So we had this nice kind of controlled matching that way. And here's what we saw. When we looked 3 months later, everybody had used the groups of kids were using more substances as a group 3 months later, right? And that was true across all groups and across all substances. But the slope of the line was much lower for the kids who had gotten the brief intervention at that 3 month point. And we published that paper in JAMA, in something called JAMA Network Open, showing that, it really had an impact. And it was, a statistically significant finding. So we really think that it had, now I had said that it didn't make any difference on alcohol use, but it did reduce nicotine use and cannabis use compared to the control groups. So, I'm a believer. The problem is that the Massachusetts schools griped a bit that it was an unfunded mandate. They were actually very happy to say that it improved things. So, the schools will say, they don't have the funding for the extra personnel, so it's always like a little bit of a dance there. But, it does look like something that really genuinely has an impact. It's modest. But, when the natural course is for kids to, especially middle schoolers, right? If they've already started using cannabis, they're going to use more frequently, more intensely over time as they get older. That's just the natural history. So if I can take this natural history timeline and bring it to here, I might be able to keep people under that addiction level, right? So, I think it's something worthwhile, if you can get it done.
Awesome. Is there a curriculum that you recommend? I know that I'm familiar with Stanford's Cannabis Toolkit. They have some free curriculum. Is there anything that you're aware of that schools can implement?
Yeah, I think that Stanford has they have vaping and they have cannabis, and I think their materials are really very good. Massachusetts used a home baked one that that I actually thought was not very strong on cannabis, so I was surprised to see the results, right? But it seemed that just like talking to an adult about this, which really sort of got kids' attention, right? What's interesting is that I think there are so few voices talking to kids about this that any single voice actually makes a difference. So, I'm not really an expert on what school-based curricula are out there, but I almost feel like it doesn't matter. If you're doing something, you're probably gonna get the impact.
Right. So folks, if you know educators, share this recording with them so that they're at least, I think that the educators I've talked to are very trepidatious about talking because they don't feel like they have a full understanding. So I appreciate that yes, then get some information, get some education so that you can, really be informed before you address this kind of topic with kids. So.
But I think that the key to the Massachusetts program is that it was an individualized session, right? So it was not, so the curriculum, I don't know if the Stanford curriculum, it might be like a classroom kind of thing. This was like one-on-one, so.
Right. I appreciate that. Okay, great. Dr. Levy, thank you so very much. This was phenomenal. So grateful to you. And thank you for that amazing audiobook and for being with us this evening. And thanks everyone for joining us.
You're very welcome.